Dealmaker Zone. Today we're at TechCrunch Disrupt in Brooklyn, New York.
In a full immersive way on your iPad. Also, you can start some videos on it. I found the official Topstack branded shot ski. We're running cold starts hypothetically. What would your approach be? You'd be really rich, that's true.
Dealmaker Zone! Yeah, baby! Yeah, you got this guy, you got him. Welcome to the Dealmaker Zone. My name's Steve Stone and I'm your host. This is a show focused on talking to the thought leaders and innovators transforming the worlds of real estate and technology. It's brought to you by AnySizeDeals Week, which is the festival of real estate innovation that takes place from September 7th through the 10th, 2021 at the Venetian Resort in Las Vegas. Our guest today is a real estate and entrepreneur extraordinaire by the name of Don Peebles. He's one of the most preeminent real estate developers in the nation and runs a portfolio worth multi-billion dollars. And we're excited to talk to him today to get a sense of his views on what's been an incredible 2020 and his thoughts on going into 2021. Don, welcome to the Dealmaker Zone.
Thanks, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Excellent.
So how's been your year so far with COVID? How has that impacted your holdings?
I mean, it's been very interesting. It has caused us to reevaluate all of our projects in development and also reevaluate how we operate as a business. Our company is a national real estate developer with projects from Boston to Miami and then in Los Angeles, and then we're expanding and re-entering the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. So we're coast to coast, multiple time zones in many different cities. And so we have been utilizing technology for a number of years. We've had 3 offices before the pandemic. We had 3 offices, Miami, Washington, D.C., and New York City. And in order for us to communicate and work together, we've used technology constantly because every weekly investment meeting, monthly development meetings have been done with video conferencing because none of us have all been in the same room at the same time. And what we've been doing for about the past 5 or 6 years is having our quarterly meetings in different office locations. So 1 quarter New York host, 1 quarter DC host, 1 quarter Miami host, and then we go somewhere else for that 4th quarter. But the idea now is that we're going to change into a distributed workforce and continue to embrace remote working. Many of our team, including me, traveled quite a bit prior to the pandemic, and so we worked remotely for quite a while. So that part of our business, we're going to be much more efficient. I think people are having a better quality of life, and fortunately, we have the ability to ride this out. And I think there will be and are becoming some significant opportunities. So we are, cautiously optimistic about the future.
So you mentioned a distributed workforce and working remotely. So is your view that in the long run, most employers are going to be forced to have remote work as part of their business strategy, and then from an owner perspective, and someone who owns office buildings and other people who own office buildings, what does that mean for the business itself?
Well, it depends on where you are. I think if you are in South Florida, Miami, Broward County, Palm Beach County, then you are optimistic. I think if you're actually in the state of Florida overall, you're probably optimistic on office because it's none of the major markets in South Florida have had a significant supply of office space to begin with. And now with remote working, companies are able to go to more business-friendly, more cost-effective municipalities and states around the country to do business. And so a lot of Northeasterners are coming down to South Florida, especially entrepreneurs, private equity, and hedge fund managers because of the no state income tax and a lower cost of business and an improved quality of life. So there, I mean, Miami Beach, et cetera, the office market is pretty positive. However, if you're in New York City, you've got to be very concerned given that 87% of the workforce has not come back to their offices yet. And people have gotten more and more comfortable with remote working, and it's proven to be very efficient. So I think the office market is in significant trouble in New York City. And then places like Washington, D.C., I mean, they've already had their hiccup downtown, but I think that overall, Again, I think you'll have a reuse of some of those buildings, but I mean, it's just market to market.
So if that's the case, so for New York City, like what can change that dynamic, right? Obviously the vaccines are, they've been approved in the UK, hopefully in the US shortly, assuming people do get vaccinated. Can that be a catalyst to kind of change people's perspective, or you think New York City, it's just too complicated and it'll just take too long?
Well, I think structurally, prior to the pandemic, some of the fundamentals in New York City were very challenging. So you already saw, prior to the pandemic, a significant disruption in the retail markets in New York City. So mortar retail, especially big box retail, had been struggling in New York City, and retail overall had been struggling, and vacancy rates for retail space in New York City had significantly increased, and that was a trend because of online shopping. As Americans shifted to online shopping, retail became more of an experience, or consuming, immediately consumed goods. And the office market was beginning to show some signs of struggle, and had it not been for co-working, you would have, the massive and rapid expansion of co-working, we would have seen vacancy rates climb in New York City, especially Manhattan, a lot earlier. So those fundamentals were already challenging. And of course, the luxury condo market was becoming oversaturated, and prices were declining, and inventory was rapidly increasing. So the pandemic, I believe, accelerated a lot of those things. Another element, New York City was becoming a lesser quality of life experience. Crime was going up. The city was, clearly getting dirtier, less maintained. There were significant infrastructure issues. And as a result of that, people were beginning to look elsewhere already. So the pandemic just accelerated, these transitions that New York was confronting to begin with. So the vaccines and everyone being vaccinated and the pandemic being behind us, that's not going to solve this. I mean, it's going to be, I think New York is probably about 10 years away from getting anywhere close to where it was in, say, 2015, 2012, 13.
I'm sorry, Greg. You have a very pessimistic view of New York City in terms of the issues that we have.
Well, I have a pessimistic, I think a realistic view of where the city is, and don't have my head in the sand. But also, I think some of this is going to be very good. New York City became basically a 5-star shopping mall with homes on it, because the market had driven the prices of residential rentals and condos up to absurd levels. It became the most expensive place to shop, and so it didn't have that more eclectic experience of what people were looking for of New York. It had forced a lot of the creative young people in the creative class and the artistic class out of the city because of the lack of affordability. That's why Brooklyn had such a rapid growth, and then it became unaffordable. So I think one of the good things that will come from this is housing is going to become much more affordable in New York City, and especially in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Also, retail will become much more affordable, and then so small businesses, entrepreneurs with creative ideas can open up retail businesses, as opposed to where it was before this pandemic, is that someone has to come in and spend, $1,000, $2,000 a square foot to open up a retail business. Those were absurd numbers. And so real estate people in my industry are going to lose a lot of money, but that's going to benefit the average New Yorker, the aspiring small business owner. I mean, Manhattan had essentially pushed out most of the small business entrepreneurs because of affordability of real estate. So that's a good thing. And I believe that the city will right it. I think the more we have a more inclusive economy, a more inclusive distribution of opportunity, I think other things will come more balanced. And ultimately, I think that clearly the city's going to have to, as a government, determine what its priorities are. it can't be everything to everybody, and it's going to have to cut the cost of operations. Once it gets to that space, then you'll see an improvement in the quality of life in New York City, and it'll be more affordable and more fun. Back to what it was in the past. New York has been this place where anyone can come and pursue their dreams, and now it became anybody can come as long as they have enough money.
So in the short run, you're more optimistic. South Florida, New York has some structural issues that have nothing to do with COVID. COVID just made the things worse, right? But in the short run, New York has some structural things that have to be addressed first and foremost.
I think that, well, let's look, I think Florida is got an optimistic outlook. New York, in the short term, has a more pessimistic outlook. Miami and Florida as a whole, as a state, is growing, it's expanding. It's on the incline. And New York City is losing people. New York State is losing population, so it's on the decline. So the question is, what's done to stop that decline? And I believe that one of the things that can stop that decline is New York becoming more affordable and attracting people again of all walks of life to come and pursue their dreams and ambitions and ideas in New York City, and be hospitable to small businesses. So that's a good thing. But I think, in the short run, there's going to be a clearing and a day of reckoning for a lot of people in the real estate business.
The way you put it, I believe you. Like you mentioned about the office sector. Now, something you've always talked about was the fact that when it comes to opportunities, the public sector has a role to play when it comes to providing African Americans with opportunities. And something that you mentioned a lot about New York City, where demographically speaking, there's a big black population, but when it comes to investments, black entrepreneurs don't usually get access to funds. During the presidential election, Ice Cube and Lil Wayne got a bit in trouble because Ice Cube met President Trump and Lil Wayne endorsed them, and they mentioned something called the Platinum Plan, right? And apparently it's something Ice Cube talked about. He said Trump had committed to spending $500 billion for the black community, right, if he was reelected. I'm assuming some of that was going to go towards entrepreneurs. Now, I have two questions. One, if there was such a plan, and let's assume that it actually came into effect, what sort of priorities would make sense? Like, how would that money best be used? And two, if there is such a plan, and Trump had talked about it with Ice Cube and whoever else he talked about, do you think the Biden administration, right, should adopt something similar, have a similar policy focused on African Americans, especially because he mentioned that his election, a lot of it was tied to the support from the black community, right? So two questions. One, what would the plan do? How would it work? And two, should the Biden administration have something similar in mind?
Well, first of all, I think that Ice Cube and Lil Wayne and anyone else who was willing to look at the Trump administration to do business with, they were unfairly criticized. Ice Cube and I were on a podcast and a talk show that Byron Allen put together with April Ryan and Tiffany Haddish, and we talked about economic empowerment for African Americans. I believe that both across the board, so black politicians, black business people, and black Americans ought to practice politics in the same way that Henry Kissinger's, the Kissinger doctrine for American foreign policy was: America has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interest. African Americans, we have so much ground to make up. We cannot afford to have permanent friends, permanent enemies. We have to have a permanent interest in our agenda moving it forward, and that is closing these absurd wealth, income, educational, home ownership gaps, health, and then the mass incarceration that our young men, and primarily our young men and women, have experienced. And so if Donald Trump was willing, he is and has been the president of the United States for almost 4 years. It is absurd to think that black people should not do business with the president of the United States. We cannot sit on the sidelines and say the black agenda for economic equality, criminal justice reform has to wait 4 years, and then pray that we get lucky and get someone who's more in keeping with our preference in office. We have to be willing and able to do business with whomever's in office to move our agenda forward. That being said, the President-elect Biden owes his existence in office to Black people. Biden would be watching the presidential transition at home if it weren't for African Americans giving him a life preserver in South Carolina and then propelling him through the Democratic primary and winning that. And then if you look at the cities that had the impact of changing the election, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and places like that, or Detroit, Wayne County, that had the impact of turning Michigan around, turning Wisconsin around, turning Georgia around, turning Pennsylvania around. Those were Black voters. So the president-elect owes his presidency to Black people. So the question is he going to pay up? And the way he pays up is we can't let him off the hook. And the vice president is a very good man. I've known him for many, many years. I have a great deal of respect for the president-elect now. I keep calling him vice president. The president-elect, the great man and a man of integrity. So I'm confident that if we can go to him with agendas, he will make positive steps. But we have to be willing to hold his feet to the fire just like we would anyone else. And you notice that he's been talking about throughout the campaign access to capital, because many of us in the Black business community have been talking to him about that. So we gotta expect a lot and have very high expectations of him.
That's well put, and I agree with all the points that you mentioned. I mean, James Clyburn in South Carolina pretty much saved his whole campaign. So in terms of specific items, like you mentioned, access to capital, right? Is there a specific, like for example, there were opportunity zones. Some people were positive on it, some people not so much in terms of the effect. Is there a specific type of program or funding, let's say for early stage companies? Is there something specific that you think would like give you the best bang for the buck, or is it something where we'd have to think through it and like come up with something? Do you have something in mind already?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I mean, I've never been a big fan of opportunity zones because the mindset there is you're going to take money from wealthy Americans who can defer and reduce their tax burden and invest in communities of color to gentrify them. That's not necessarily a good thing. What we want to do is we want to have our communities' economic conditions expand and be uplifted by economic activity within the community for the people living in it. And I think there's no better way to do that than to have people who are a part of the community, who can trace their history to the community, to be a part of the community's recovery. In addition to that, Black business people, especially Black real estate entrepreneurs, should not be relegated only to Black communities. There's no reason that we can't have Black developers doing projects in Soho, Tribeca, the West Village, the Upper East Side, and other places. And these other developers who are doing these projects are no smarter than the Black developers in the marketplace. They just have easy access to capital because the capital is being allocated by their friends and their classmates from college or high school. And we need to level that playing field across the board. And I think the number one issue that the President of the United States can do is level the playing field by mandating equality when it comes to access to capital.
Okay, absolutely. So when it comes to the United States as a whole, from a macro perspective, right? So we have the current president is challenging the results of the election, right? And we've had a tumultuous past 4 years. How do you think the world perceives the U.S.? Like, what is their standing vis-a-vis the world? Do you think it's the same as it always was? Do you think it's not what it used? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, if you look at Donald Trump, the biggest criticism to Donald Trump was his demeanor, his way of speaking, his way of conducting himself. And that was the big pushback on him by and large, if you look at the criticism. But if you look at some of his economic policies, while they wouldn't be mocked, many of them were effective in terms of the goals that he wanted. So I think that people saw America as a place that was in somewhat disarray and in conflict, but being more aggressive and being more nationalist in terms of protecting America's own interests. And I think some of those policies, I think that President-elect Biden ought to give some serious thought to considering. I mean, we do need to manufacture our products here. It is absurd to me that most of the ingredients for our pharmaceuticals are actually manufactured in China, and what an impact that could have if they decided not to manufacture or export them to us anymore.
Is it a cost issue or is it a knowledge issue, do you think?
Oh, I think it's a cost issue. It's more because our country, because of our, the way our politics have gone, have made it very difficult for us to manufacture and produce products in this country. And that's got to change. A big part of that has to change is tort reform. I mean, there's legal liability, and these lawyers and these class action lawsuits run up the cost of our goods and products. But I mean, things for the national interest of our country, like our medical products and our prescription medications and the raw ingredients to manufacture them, need to be manufactured here in the United States. We need to be to protect ourselves. So those are the kinds of things that we ought to look at. However, what Trump did not do is he did not broaden the benefit of the expanded economy. We had a historically low level of unemployment, a historic expansion, but it didn't reach most Americans in terms of uplifting Americans to improve the quality of their lives. And so what I'm hopeful that a Biden administration will do is expand the impact and improve the quality of life for a large number of American citizens. And I think there, hopefully we'll see a shift in policy, but I do think that we need to be pro-business. And we also need to recognize, and by the way, I have a different view, and it may not be the most popular view when it comes to, say, affirmative action or economic inclusion. So I operate from the perspective that we have to deal with the issue that this country and the founders of this country and those who built this country did to African Americans. This country was built with free labor, 246 years of free labor, and then 100 plus years of depressed and oppressed labor by Black people. And this country and the land that created the United States was stolen from Native Americans. So America can trace its success in part because of free labor from African Americans and land from Native Americans. Now, that doesn't take away the fact that many of our citizens have contributed to the expansion and growth of our country for our nation's history. However, they were compensated for it. Our people have not been. So this country owes African Americans and Native Americans a major debt. However, other people who immigrate to this country, they came here looking for a better life than their native country of where they came from. And they, more often than not, found it here in this country. So they owe America a debt. That is a big difference. And so to include them with any kind of agenda to correct the historic wrongs that have been done to Black people and to Native Americans is really unacceptable. And I think this whole idea, I mean, Jesse Jackson's been a good friend and mentor of mine, but this idea of a rainbow coalition, maybe politically, but when it comes down to economic inclusion, this country owes a debt to two groups of people, African Americans and Native Americans, and it needs to stop there. And I think there would be greater support and greater tolerance for that because it's got logic to it. And I think that that's where this administration, this incoming administration, needs to focus its interest. And then we can get to a place where we're post-racial. Once America makes right and does right by African Americans and Native Americans. And of course, no one can ever repay the loss of life and the deplorable conditions that African Americans and Native Americans experienced as this country was built by them on their land for free. And that's what's got to change. But we can't, otherwise this country is a land of opportunity, and it has provided it for the vast majority of its citizens.
I couldn't have said it better. So from what I hear, I think you're for reparations then in that context, right?
As a part of a economic policy, but not only.
Okay.
But because I don't think it can stop there. I mean, you have to think about the impact of slavery and Jim Crow and the oppression, the destruction of our family unit, the destruction of any kind of educational structure, the denial of equal access to health care, equal access to education. My grandfather worked in the, he was born, and my father was born in segregated Virginia. And my grandfather worked as a janitor in a public school system that was close to where he lived. However, his kids, my father and my aunts, couldn't attend that school. They had to walk further to an inferior school to get an education. And then when my father served in the Korean War and served his country and was injured, he came back to a country that would not give him a fair shake at opportunity. Those kinds of systemic, structural oppression cannot be remedied by just the payment of some money. I mean, there needs to be aggressive, affirmative steps. But America will never have tolerance for that with that group of people being broad to include people who cannot trace their history to that. So again, people who immigrate, they owe the country a debt. African Americans and Native Americans, I would argue this country owes us a debt. And there's the big difference. And I think most Americans would find that a compelling argument. But I just don't see how we've been, by including so many groups of people, it has diminished the devastating impact, or it's diminished the perception of the devastating impact that it has that slavery and segregation have had on Black people.
Well, Don, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. This was a fascinating conversation. It's actually the first time we had a conversation really focused on these broad issues. So, again, thank you so much, and have a great rest of the year. Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Thank you, and the same to you, Steve.
Thank you. And that's the Dealmaker Zone for this week. If you want to be on the show, please send us an email at show@AnySizeDeals.com, and that's the last word.